And we're live. Hello, everyone. How are you? Just had a haircut, prickly back. Hi. Keep getting some emails from people that usually attend saying, really sorry, Jamie, today I can't make it. You don't have to let me know. This is, but I appreciate it. I think it's summertime. I think a lot of people have got outdoor activities. Who wants to stay stuck in front of a screen? That's what I think. Nice to see you, though, the hardcores. Just a little word of an apology here, first of all. There will be no elephants, despite the icon that I've included there in the thumbnail image. There are no elephants in this presentation. I thought there might be. Turns out there's not a single elephant. I had to obviously choose a picture, and that's what I chose. I liked it. I thought it was kind of an example of a narrative-rich image. What do I mean by a narrative-rich image? That'll come another day. Hello, Magdalena. Hello there, Ildiko. And hello, Bath City Language Coaching, Elevate Your English. Great way to get a little shout out, isn't that? But we still don't know your name. What's your name? Oh, Simon. Simon for Bath there. I didn't even read your... Hello, Simon. Yeah, these are always recorded. All you have to do is watch them at the same URL. You know, that's the beauty of this. And if you're watching this not live, I hope you're having a nice day in the future. And if you are watching this live, feel free to take that URL, post it in a Facebook group, tell people it's all happening, and that would make me happy. Hello, Pedro. So I hope you're not worried about the lack of elephants in this presentation, but we're talking all about story. And I'm going to take you back to begin this. I'm going to take you back to 2017. Do you ever bookmark articles? I certainly do. I've got hundreds of bookmarked articles, and this is one of many bookmarked articles I have. It came to me through The Guardian, written by a British author called Tim Lott. And this came on the back of some controversy in the UK, actually in England, the English national curriculum. I wonder if you remember this. I think it was Michael Gove, who was the then education secretary or secretary for education. It was on the back of stuff that his recommendations that the syllabus in the UK became incredibly in language, it became incredibly grammar centric, and kids were subjected to some really hardcore grammar and were required to identify and talk about grammatical terms, stuff that probably goes over many of our heads, despite the fact that we are language teachers. And a lot of teachers were unhappy about this, as were parents, as were students. I mean, this is a great way to kill any joy that young people might have for language at an early time. And one of the things teachers kept doing was, okay, they might be able to recognize a fronted adverbial, but they're unable to use the language and appreciate the beauty of it and to tell stories. Let me just show you what I've got here. This was the bookmarked article that Tim Lott, that I mentioned to you, wrote. Ditch the grammar and teach children storytelling instead. And in this article, Tim Lott refers to a report from the Times, another newspaper, in which a secondary school teacher, talking about this grammar thing, said that her year 7 students, those are 11 and 12-year-olds, well, let me read you this quote, because the teacher is quoted as saying, they knew what a fronted adverbial was and how to spot an internal clause and a preposition, but when I set them a task to write a story, they broke down and cried. I think it's quite sad, but it's quite a funny image, isn't it? Your entire class of students breaking down and crying because you've asked them to write a story. I think there might be a little exaggeration there, but I don't know. I still quite, exaggeration or not, I find that quite amusing, don't you? And Tim Lott, this author, then goes on to say that, Um, storytelling is more than simply an art. It's a crucial skill for life and commerce. And I agree with that. It's strange, isn't it, that storytelling is, it seems to me that it's the quintessential 21st century skill if you go in for that sort of thing. And yet it's the one that often gets omitted. I see 21st century skills being critical thinking, for example, whatever it is, digital literacies, but storytelling very rarely, if ever, it seems to me, makes an appearance. And I don't know why. I studied science, I studied biochemistry at school, and I still have friends who are biochemists, some from that class. And so much has changed since then. I mean, apart from the crazy, incredible advances in science, scientists have been trained and taught to communicate their findings and their research results using story. When I was there, we had to stand up and talk figures, and that would generally not get people's attention. If you wanted to make people fall asleep, give them figures. And scientists are being trained to communicate through story, the story of their thesis, the story of their research, the story of what they found. And being trained to understand how story works is an important part of this. Similarly, marketers use story to sell, politicians use story to persuade us. It's always there. It's a very important skill. Estelle, hello, says that story is key to explain data. Yes, exactly. Hello, Delia. Nice to see you. Hello, Gillian. Nice to see you too. Now in Newbury in England. And so it's very important, I think. And as a starting point, this is still the same article. And I wonder what you think of this. This might make teachers of young learners slightly upset. People say that children are natural storytellers, but this is not at all true, any more than it is of adults, or rather, they are not naturally good storytellers. Most stories by children, although they may be charming, are boring because they are just one connected event after another. In other words, they make no sense, have no direction, causality, or point. And when I read this, I wonder how this makes, as I mentioned, my friends, my teacher friends of young learners, because I do agree with this wholeheartedly. I remember seeing a teacher at a conference once showing a video of a kid, must have been about 6 or 7 years old, telling a story. And this, as Tim Lott says, it was very charming and it was sweet and it was cute and the child was lovable. And everyone went, "Oh, isn't that nice?" But the implication cannot be that the stories are good. They're not. And so the question is, well, how then can we train people at an early stage to tell better stories? And I mean, that our article was kind of involved in, was primarily concerned with children. And in LessonStream, we're more about, storytelling or stories for teenagers and adults. But whether you're dealing with kids or teens or adults, or whether you're working with business people or politics or scientists or whatever, a lot of the principles are the same. Simon's got some experience this. They usually end, "and then I woke up." Yes, exactly. So I wonder, have you, as teachers, assuming that those of you who are present today are teachers, do you get involved in any story building activities with your students? I don't know where the term story building came from, but it came to me through this book by a friend of mine called Jane Spiro. I say she's a friend, but the truth is I've only ever met her once. And we got on very well. She was very lovely. I told her that I'm a fan of her book. I've actually tried to get in touch with her, but she's seems to me not answering her emails or not receiving them. So if anyone knows Jane Spiro, can you let her know I've been trying to contact her? And story building is basically inventing stories. It could be creative writing, it could be speaking activities, it could be improvisation activities. but it's inventing stories, maybe stories from images, pictures, story dice. And I think that what we're going to look at today, the principles that we're going to look at today, would be very, very useful for using with any of these story building activities. Now, do you know? Did any of you watch this? This was it was a lesson stream live I did a few months ago when got my friend Chris Rose, who goes by the author name of CD Rose, and Chris is he's got a doctorate in literary theory, and Chris provided a critique of a story that had been written by ChatGTP. I've put the link to this in the chat below. Sorry, the description below. If you've not seen it, I really recommend that you watch this video. If you're, and it was really quite eye opening. And Chris, it was over a lot of our heads because Chris got really deep. But a lot of the principles that Chris spoke about will be relevant to this. And we're going to start this actually with some story dice. This is a picture that I took just about an hour ago. I wonder if you can see this. I had to, this is the same. I don't need to show you this. But you know story dice, I'm sure. Story dice or story cubes. These ones are called Rory's story cubes. The idea is that students throw the dice. They get 9 icons. You can see them in front of you, and they have to write a story with these icons. And here's a story that was prepared earlier. This one was written by ChatGTP. Oliver, a curious fisherman, finds a credit card in his net and feels it holds a deeper meaning. He follows the river and arrives at a busy city with a tall building. At a marketplace, he discovers scales that remind him of making careful choices in life. While exploring, he comes across a sleeping person holding a magnifying glass, which helps him uncover hidden truths. Feeling a mysterious force, Oliver is drawn to a powerful magnet that leads him across a bridge into a magical forest. I don't know what it is about ChatGPT. It loves magical forests. Within that magical forest, he discovers a hidden sanctuary that awakens his true potential and purpose. After his transformative journey, Oliver returns to his village, forever changed. He shares his extraordinary story, inspiring others to embark on their own quests of self-discovery. The village embraces the spirit of exploration, uncovering hidden treasures within themselves and in the world around them. I hope you agree that is a terrible, terrible story. ChatGPT can do some things quite well, but stories is not one of them. And I remember when ChatGPT first became popular all those months ago, one of the things that people were doing, my God, it can write stories. But this, it didn't get Chris excited, because really Chris refers to them as sort of story-like. You know, they kind of look like stories, and they're story-like in the sense that he referred to, or he created a parallel with coffee-like beverage. I don't know where Chris had been drinking coffee-like beverages, but coffee-like beverages sort of look like coffee, might smell like coffee, but they are not coffee. They are a coffee-like beverage. So watch that video if you haven't seen it. Now, I would just to come to ChatGPT's defense here. ChatGPT, despite that terrible, terrible story, ChatGPT did kind of fulfill the task. And the task was to take all 9 of these icons and to create a narrative. And that seems to be the task that teachers often give to their students. And I've seen teachers getting very excited about story dice. And I think teachers love any kind of activity or any resource that we can set it up and students can just get on with it. Students are motivated and engaged. The teacher can take a back seat, and we all know the value in that, and we all love that type of dynamic. We can see how important it is. And I think that Story Dice is one such resource. Uh, but I think that, however, um, when you set this up, when you give the task to students, throw the dice and write a story based on those 9 icons, you're actually setting up things for bad stories. Because as you can see, ChatGTP, the story that ChatGTP has created is not, in fact, a million miles away from the kind of stories that I've seen coming from human beings in response to story dice. And the reason is because when you have to create a story and you have to kind of push 9 different items into the story, you're taking on too big a challenge. The story that comes out of it is invariably going to be bad. And in fact, if any of you've used these before, this brand of story dice is called Rory's Story Cubes. And even Rory's Story Cubes offers some terrible, terrible advice in its instructions. Rory's Story Cubes, whoever Rory is, I have no idea if Rory is a person, but the instructions say, if you want to create better stories with story dice, divide your story into 3 parts. Okay, maybe something here, and try to allocate 3 icons to each part of your story. No, that is absolutely terrible, terrible advice. So if the first part of your story involves a fish, a magnet, and a sleeping person, the second part involves a question mark, a set of scales, and a high building, etc. Where is the continuity? That is a really, really bad way to set up a story. And I think that going back to this idea that, yes, we can set up tasks in which the teacher takes a back seat and lets students get on with it. However, minimal teacher input does not mean zero teacher input. And I think that if we're going to use story dice in the classroom and use them to set up story building tasks for students, I think it's really, really important that we can offer a little bit of guidance, a little bit of input, a little bit of understanding of how to create better stories from story by dice in this case, and any prompt, really. And that's really what this is all about, okay? Now, some of you here, and I can see you here, are in the LessonStream community. You're LessonStream members. So I wonder if you're aware that we have a new lesson plan in the membership. It's titled How Stories Work. And if you're in the LessonStream membership, you can access this. If you're not in LessonStream membership, you can join. If you don't want to join, don't worry. A lot of these principles we're going to be looking at. Let me just give you one example of a principle. And if we go back to that really bad story that ChatGTP wrote, this one right here, and you can see I've underlined those 9 different elements. What you've got here is these kind of ideas. They just pop up, don't they? From out of nowhere. And where do they go? They go nowhere. They're pointless. And if you wanted to describe this in a diagram, you could maybe look at it this way. This is how ChatGTP writes stories, and also this is how stories are often written or often come out of story dice. Something happens, and then something else happens, and then something else happens, and then something else happens, and finally this happens. Now, that's an example of a bad approach to stories. That is not how good stories work. Good stories work like this. Something happens, but then something happens, so that at first thing, there was a problem. And because of that, something else happens. And so something else happens, but then something else happens. And finally, now in story writing, in story, this is referred to as causality. And we already mentioned that. If we go back to this quote by Tim Lott, he said that most stories by children, although they may be charming, are boring because they are just one unconnected event after another. In other words, they make no sense, have no direction, causality, or point. And we've just seen causality illustrated, or rather we've seen a lack of causality. In this book I mentioned, Jane Spiro demonstrates causality with an activity, which I think is very interesting. She says, she compares these two sentences. The dancer died, then the clown lost his job. No causality there. The dancer died because the clown lost his job. There's causality there. Now, neither of those I would say is a story, but the second one is more story-like. The second one is much more interesting. The second one, we have the seeds of a story. So that's one example of a principle of story and storytelling that we can pass on to our students. We can make them aware of. They're not suddenly going to start creating better stories, but like language, storytelling is emergent. It takes time. It takes constant revisiting and reminding and questioning and feedback. And these are things that we can raise our own awareness of as teachers and pass down to our students. Causality is one. Okay, is everybody happy? Just check you're still there. I think you are. Yes. All right. So let's move on. Now I've got a story for you. I don't know what you're going to think of this story. Maybe I won't call it a story. Maybe I'm going to call it a text. Let me read this text to you. It involves one of my favorite simple foods. I'm a big fan of this. I would say I make this probably once a week. Here's the text. John was making guacamole. He took a ripe avocado, cut it in half, and removed the stone. He scooped out the green flesh with a spoon and put it in a bowl. Then he added some lime juice, a chopped tomato, and some chopped onion. Finally, he mashed all the ingredients together. That's the text. The question is, however, is it a story? And I'd like you to think about that right now. Is it a story? Is this a story? And I love that question. And I love this activity. And this is an activity that was inspired actually from this book of Jane Spiro's again. In fact, it's the very, very first activity in her book. She uses a different text. The text she uses is called Petunia the Parrot. I've created this text. I've got my reasons for doing so. I think it lends itself very well to this activity, and it allows me to avoid copyright issues with Jane's book. So Pedro says maybe this is the introduction to one, but without any other information, I think the question is, as this is it a story? I'm not even going to allow you to quantify it with any adjectives, for example. Yes, it's a bad story. This is a binary decision on your part. Either yes, it's a story, or no, it's a story. And you can type your answer into the chat. There is to be no discussion or debate. However, that's going to come next. Because what I'd like from you now is I'd like you to think of reasons why this is a story and reasons why it is not a story. So regardless of what you have decided, regardless of whether you think this is a story or this is not a story, I want you to focus on reasons for to start with. And I'd like you to type into the chat, this is a story because, and you could say, for example, this is a story because it has a main character and his name is John. That would be a good example. So if you could type into the chat reasons why this is a story. For example, this is a story because it has a main character. His name is John. We've had Ildiko says it's not a story yet, so I'm going to take that as a no. We've got Simon who says yes, it is a story Gillian says no, again, not yet. It's very difficult, isn't it, to just say yes or no. I found that anyway. I've been doing this and I've discovered that we want to. And Magdalena says no, not really. And I've tried this a few times. I've tried this many times actually. And in fact, I was under the impression that most people, when they have to make that yes or no decision, will say yes, it is a story. You've said a yes because it sets the context right away, says Simon. So yes, it is a story because it sets the context right away. I would like you to elaborate on that a little bit, Simon, if you want to. You don't have to. There is a connection between context and story. I always say, as a language teacher, when we look back at the context, let's say that a word came up, let's imagine a term came up in class, we could refer to it as emergent language. I wrote a blog post about this, I shared recently. If you wanted to talk about the context of that, that's very much connected to the story, because then you've got to go back to which class did it come up, who said it, what were they talking about, why were they saying this thing? That's very much related to story. And so I always think that context is the story of the emergent language. So I'm wondering what you're saying in response to my question, Simon. You know sort of where it's going. Okay. Gillian says immediately talks about guacamole, which you like. All right. So we're talking into the universe of the guacamole universe. And Simon continues that it engages the reader. It engages the reader. Do you think maybe that it disengages the reader when it comes to an end, and the reader might be thinking, what? Is that all? Which leads us into the second part of the question. I think you're going to have more to say here. If it's not a story, then why not? Could you type your answer into the chat? This is not a story because, in other words, what does it lack? We've said it has a main character. We've said we could say it has a beginning, a middle, an end, something which people often say about stories. They have a beginning, a middle, an end. I don't think that's enough to define a story, because dogs also have beginnings, middles, and ends. The beginnings could be its nose, the middle is its body, and the end is its tail, isn't it? But a dog is not a story. A dog is a dog. How would you continue this? It is a story because Estelle, you see actions but not the emotions related to. For you, it's a recipe. That's interesting. It's a recipe but not a story. Pedro thinks it's too condensed, too much just condensed information. Is it maybe a recipe? I like this idea. It's a recipe masquerading as a story. I mean, you could. I've yeah. I once wrote about. I mean, I'm quite fascinated by recipes. I've done this before. In fact, this is the reason I've used this. I think that recipes there's a narrative running through it. If you define a narrative as being a sequence of events, I think any process in a way has a narrative. As again, we can refer to that beginning, middle, and end thing, but it doesn't mean that a recipe falls into a sort of narrative structure, unless, of course, the ingredients are the characters, in which case it becomes quite a horrific story, doesn't it? A tragedy almost, in which all the characters are brutally murdered in a variety of different ways, and then sort of just combined and blended in a horrific way, and then consumed at the end. I'm not even sure that's definitely something which starts to resemble a story, isn't it? I don't know if we have a story yet, but it's something more story-like. Okay, so Simon likes the final word. Then I'd like the final word to be then. Sorry. So that's maybe it's missing. So we're still on this. We're still talking about why it is not a story. No phrase or word to tickle your interest. No causality, says Vicky. Is there a plot? I mean, it depends on, I would say it depends on how you define a plot, Magdalena. But I mean, so what makes this not a story then? There's a lot of things, but we can come back to this. Okay, we can come back to this. So let's just we've got this. I mentioned this lesson plan here. And what this lesson plan does is it uses that text, it uses this discussion, this guacamole text and the discussion, and then we bring into play 8 terms about story, which are all about principles of how story works, terms that we can use to define what a story is. So I wonder which of these you're familiar with. We've already looked at one, and that is causality. There's actually a worksheet in the lesson plan in which students match these 8 terms with their simple definitions. And I'm just looking at your comment here, Nick, because you're bringing into play a lot of the well, in a sort of roundabout way, a lot of the terms here. So you've said 5 elements of a story are exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and conclusion. Now that's according to some models. I've heard of these 5 elements of a story: rising action and climax. As a teacher and as a trainer, I much prefer to go with just 3 parts rather than 5 parts. And I'm going to show you this in a moment. And there's a lot to talk about here. There's a lot to discuss. There's even a lot to argue about, because there are different models and different ways to describe it. So these are. I don't want you to think by the way that there are 8 parts to a story. If that's what you're thinking right now, then I'm misleading you. So let me show you something here. If I show you these 3 icons, can you identify the story? I spent ages. I spent a long time actually trying to find 3 icons that can be used to illustrate the point I'm going to make here. It's a story that I'm sure all of you will know. The icon on the left, if I'm going to give you a little clue, it should be yellow. It should be yellow. So what is the story? Yeah, exactly. Simon's got it. It's The Wizard of Oz. So let me just I've taken these icons and we had Nick there talk about 5 different elements of a story. In fact, if we wanted to talk about elements, a lot of people would say that there's 8 elements, and we're talking not about chronological parts, but we're talking about things like character, setting, plot, theme, conflict. These are ingredients, we could say. But if we're talking about parts here, taking the story beginning at the beginning and ending at the end and cutting it up accordingly, which is what you're doing there, Nick. I think I feel that as a trainer, as a teacher, it's much easier to communicate this. It's much more practical if we can just split it into 3 parts. And that's exactly what you see in front of you, 3 parts. Part 1 being the setup, which is represented by that yellow brick road. So we all know what happens. I assume we all know. Dorothy, a young girl from Kansas. Did I say Kansas? Dorothy, a young girl from Kansas. She's caught up in a tornado in black and white, or more kind of sepia color, doesn't it? And she's transported into the magical land of Oz. And the only way for her to get home is to walk the yellow brick road to the Emerald City and get help from the Wizard of Oz. It's really funny because in creating this lesson plan, I actually watched The Wizard of Oz about a week ago. First time I've watched it in ages. And I wonder if any of you watched The Wizard of Oz recently. Basically, because I remember when I was a kid, I watched The Wizard of Oz for the first time, and I said to my parents, "Oh, it's in black and white." And it's actually more sepia, sort of nice hues of brown and white. When I watched it as an adult, I think I appreciated the introduction of The Wizard of Oz, which is in black and white, because when it moves on to the color, and it's just so obviously in a studio, and as great a story as it is, and it really is. I mean, it's revered as one of the most fantastic movies of all time. But I couldn't help thinking at this stage, which is very specifically the image that happens at the very end of the setup. So we know Dorothy, we know who she is, we know her character, we know what she wants. She wants to get home, and this is the Munchkins saying goodbye to her. She's doing it alone, taking the yellow brick road. And I'm thinking, no, Dorothy, stop. Don't go any further. You're going to walk into that wall. Because there's a wall just a few meters in front of her. But the camera actually, well, we cut to the next scene, don't we? Before she bumps into that wall, which is a good thing, because I don't think I would want to see that. I think that could be quite a horrific accident, coming back with a bleeding nose. So I'm glad that we didn't actually ever see Dorothy walking into the wall. So that's the setup. The setup, when we meet the main character, we learn about them, we learn what they want. And Dorothy, this young girl from Kansas, we know about her family life. We know who she is. She owns this dog. We know that she's somewhere she doesn't want to be. We know she has to get home. That is the setup, and things would be simple, wouldn't they? She'd get to Oz, she'd meet the wizard and all that, but except for the fact that things are not simple, because unfortunately for Dorothy, the Wicked Witch of the West has other plans. And the Wicked Witch of the West wants to get her revenge on Dorothy, because don't forget, Dorothy, when she landed in Oz, her house landed on top of the Wicked Witch of the East and killed her. And the Wicked Witch of the West, her sister, now wants her revenge on Dorothy. This is such a great, screenplay and script writing, isn't it? And so that's the conflict. So if we think of a story as being a character that needs something or wants something or has a motivation, and then there's a conflict stands in the way of that, becomes an obstacle, that is possibly one of the most simple ways to describe what a story is. And it's certainly a very practical way to present it to students. And I know this is what a lot of people that teach storytelling in business, this is how they present it. And so if we go back to, more complex ways of describing story and story form. Who was it? It was Nick here. A lot of people will say, yeah, well, this very much is. We can talk about 3-act structure. And 3-act structure sounds very simple, but in fact, it can get incredibly complex. And we use it maybe for kind of analyzing or describing much more complicated forms. If we're working with students, we're starting first steps, we're starting simple, we're creating very short stories. And so I think it's much more practical to start simple. And that's why that's why I've taken a long time to be able to take these ideas and be able to communicate them simply. So finally, we have the conflict. And the conflict is, when Dorothy defeats the witch, arrives at the Emerald City, meets the wizard, and returns to Kansas. And of course, she learns a lesson. In the meantime, she learns a lesson about the importance of home and the people she loves. And so, story is about change. Story always involves change. If a story doesn't involve change, it's a bad story. And ChatGTP knows this, and ChatGTP tries to cheat. If you watch any story that, if you read any story that ChatGTP creates, look how much it tries to push home the change. Look at that last paragraph. After his transformative journey, Oliver returns to his village forever changed. He shares his extraordinary story, but it doesn't stick with us, ChatGTP. You can't just throw all these grand words into it and expect us to believe that what you've got there is a great story, because it isn't. On the other hand, The Wizard of Oz, we know what happens in it, and we know that it involves real change from Dorothy. And so these are the three of these key terms that I showed you before: the setup, conflict, resolution. We've also got causality. So when I showed you that diagram here, we've now used up 4 of those. So let me just keep going here a bit. And the lesson plan that I've mentioned, this one here, which is the most recent lesson plan in the LessonStream membership, includes a handout for students, which has taken me quite a long time, a matter of months, to compile. And it looks like this: how stories work. And this is intended to be a reference for students when they're creating their own stories in response to any story building task, be it story dice, creative writing, improvisation, speaking tasks, any prompt whatsoever. This is something that you can give to them. It encompasses all 8 of those terms, which are setup, conflict, resolution, plot, causality, stakes, character, and setting. You see? And if we go back to this, it's worth looking at, well, there's 2 other terms we haven't looked at yet, but which are very, very important to storytelling. And somebody mentioned elements of storytelling. But the 3 most fundamental elements of storytelling are often said to be number 1, character; number 2, plot; and number 3, setting, often given in that order. I'm not sure if that implies there's a hierarchy, but if you look at this, and the suggested activity in the lesson plan is that once students have come through this worksheet and process of being introduced to this theory very gently, they then revisit this text and they try and rework it in such a way so that it starts to resemble something more story-like. So let's just take these one at a time, and let's talk about John, because really, stories are about people. Stories are always about people. And you might say, well, not always. Stories can be about inanimate objects. Just think of Toy Story. They can be about animals, Animal Farm. They can be about aliens and in Avatar. Well, yes, but these are still animals or aliens or objects behaving like human beings. They're still human-like with personalities. Stories are always about human-like creatures. To really care about the story, we have to know about the people. How much did we get to know about Dorothy by the end of the setup, when she goes running off just before she crashes into that wall in the studio? We knew a lot about her. What do we know here? Well, we know 2 things. We know, number 1, there's a human being called John. We assume that John is a human being. And number 2, that he's making guacamole in the standard way. That's all we know. And that's really not enough. So what if we were to maybe try to give John some more dimensions? What if, for example, John had been spending months or even years planning the opening of his restaurant, where he had a dream of making the best brunch in town. And he's just opened his restaurant, and his very first customer has come in, and what has that customer ordered? Guacamole. So with all the enthusiasm that John has been kind of building up over the past months or year, John is actually making the very first dish for his very first customer. Now, that's not a story yet, but it's starting to become more story-like, isn't it? You know? What else could we say? We could talk about the setting. And there we've just changed the setting. The setting came out of the character, because that's what happens. Setting and character are intertwined. One affects the other. So in a way, characters are born out of their environments, and environments have a direct effect on the plot. In starting to think about who John is, we suddenly found him in a restaurant. So if we assumed that this story was taking place in a kitchen of some sort or another, what if we started to play with the setting? And what if we decided to put it somewhere strange, like, for example, a prison cell? Suddenly that could start to become quite interesting. If this takes place in a prison cell, then who is John? Is John a prisoner? Maybe we start to think about the story in which John, this prisoner, he's sick of prison food, and he's had the ingredients smuggled in by somebody who loves him. Somebody who loves him has managed to smuggle in all these ingredients during visiting time, and now John is trying to create guacamole in his prison cell. And maybe there's a conflict. Maybe the prison guard has caught wind of something and is walking towards the prison cell. Is John going to be able to finish the guacamole and eat it before he gets caught? And just by looking at these different elements and playing with them, we can start to create something which is more story-like. And this is very specifically what your students are going to do in this lesson plan. And did you notice that what I did there, I created a what we can refer to as the story stakes. Do you know that term, the story stakes, which was the 8th term when I introduced those 8 different terms here? We had stakes was the first one. Character, causality, setup, resolution, setting, conflict, plots. These are the 8 terms I like students to be aware of. Stakes is maybe the odd one out, because students don't need to be aware of stakes, but as a teacher, there's a good reason why I want students to know about stakes. And I'm going to tell you why. And if you're still not sure what the stakes are, I will tell you in just a moment. This lesson plan that I mentioned is just one of about 5 or 6 lesson plans in the LessonStream membership, which are designed specifically to get students to raise their awareness of how story works. We've got a lesson plan on Story Dice, which looks at what the teacher can do in order to intervene, or at least not intervene, but to set students up for storytelling success before they get working with the story dice. There's some really simple principles that we can pass on to students, so that they're not just going to get on with it, but you can just, with some minimal teacher input, we can maximize results and get better students from stories. No, better stories from students. We've also got this one. I love this activity. And if you're in a LessonStream membership and you've never used this, it's fantastic. This uses 3 musical excerpts, which kind of really beautifully illustrate or allow students to hear a setup, a conflict, and resolution. And students have got to take inspiration from those 3 musical excerpts to design an advert for a product of their choice. And what's so great is that those 3 musical excerpts actually come from an advert, so students actually get to see a real advert later. I said real, but is it? And finally, the LessonStream Story Course, which is the place for teachers to develop their own storytelling skills, learn to use experience. I'm starting to lose the ability to talk. Learn to use story to engage students and get them doing stuff. And of course, which is most relevant here, train students to be storytellers themselves. That's all there for you if you'd like to join the LessonStream membership. And if you're a director of studies or if you're in a school, we also have institutional memberships. Just drop me a line and let me know. Links below. Let me just show you what I was talking about before, the stakes game. So this is all about story stakes. And I like the icon of a bomb for this, because bombs and films, bombs often give rise to the stakes. Although you've got to look at it in the right way. If there's ever a bomb in a story, it's not about the bomb, it's about the people, or rather about the person. The question is not, will the bomb go off? The bomb's always going to go off. The question is, will the main character be able to prevent the bomb from going off? Will the main character be able to intervene? And even then, it's not something so abstract of that. We've got to know about the character. We've got to know what this means to the character and why it's so important to the character that the bomb doesn't go off. Maybe the bomb is in, I don't know, is in a tower block where it's Liam Neeson, for example, and he's got to save his daughter. I'm thinking about that film Taken. So it's not just about bombs, it's about people. But what the stakes are is very much about the conflict. So you know who the character is, you know what the character wants, and then the conflict happens, the obstacle happens, and often that gives rise to a question, a will they or won't they question. You know, will they fall in love? Will he get the girl? Will she get the guy? Will he prevent the bomb from going off? And as soon as you've got a central question like that, then you've got the story stakes. Now, in short stories, you probably only want one stakes, I'm going to guess, maybe not. But in more complex stories like The Wizard of Oz, there's multiple stakes. For example, Frodo the dog bites that woman who then wants to take the dog away and get the dog euthanized. Toto the dog, that's the first stakes. Will she or won't she? Then Dorothy lands. Will she survive the tornado? Will she get home? Will she defeat the Wicked Witch? Will she get to the Emerald City? Will she meet the Wizard of Oz? Will he grant her whatever it is that he does to get her back home? Will she get back home? It's sometimes it's stakes after stakes and several stakes happening at once. And then there's the other characters as well. Will the Scarecrow get the brains? Will the Tin Man get the heart? Will the Lion Man get courage, etc.? So this is what good storytelling is. There are stakes, and those stakes get raised. And so this is the stakes game, and you lead by example as the teacher. You tell your students, you give students an example of a story from cinema, from theater, from TV, from literature, and you describe the story to them using some of this terminology that we've already seen. So two young lovers want to live happily ever after, but unfortunately their feuding families won't have it. A very simple one there. I think you know what it is. You can write your answers in the chat if you like. But you students may or may not want to use any of this terminology. I've chosen not to. The answer here, of course, is yes, you know it. It's Romeo and Juliet. So here we've got the next one is, in this story, a teacher gets involved in a life of crime. His goal is to launder the millions of dollars he makes so that he can secure his family's financial future. But the obstacle is that he has terminal cancer and has limited time to do so. Can you identify the story, where it comes from? I'm sure you know. I'm sure some of you might know. By the way, this is a game that you can play with ChatGTP. And I've been doing this. So you just teach ChatGTP the rules. You give ChatGTP an answer. Make sure you tell ChatGTP not to include the title of the story or the film or whatever in the text that ChatGTP generates, because ChatGPT just doesn't seem to understand that that's going to ruin it. And Simon's got the answer. Yes, it is. It's Breaking Bad. And the third one I've got, in this story, the hero has to destroy an evil object and save the land. But the evil object has other ideas. It wants to corrupt and control anyone who possesses it, tempting them with power and driving them towards darkness. The stakes are, will the hero be able to do this? Will the hero resist the temptation or be destroyed in the process? I'm sure you know the answer to this one. What is the story? Who is the hero? What is the evil object? And where does this story take place? What is the setting? What is this fictitious place? I know you know the answer. I know they're not coming quickly because there's the time delay between us, but we're talking here the One Ring in capital letters, isn't it? The One Ring, and the land is Middle Earth. So the answer here is the Lord of the Rings. Yes, that's right. Let me just very quickly finish by going back to the story dice. And last year, some of you may have been here. I'm not sure. Those of you who are here right now, taking part in this live, and we did a webinar. We had a fishbowl, a LessonStream social event where we all got involved in some story writing through story dice, and we all created stories. And we all looked at the traps that maybe we'd fallen into writing stories without any guidance. We then looked at some very simple principles of story and went on to write a second story. And what you see in front of you was a story which came from some of you. I'm looking at maybe, I know Elizabeth's here, a LessonStream member. Pedro, maybe you were there. But I'm not sure. I think it was Simon was involved in this story. So let me just show you this story. We called this the Detective Fish. Once upon a time, there was a fish with a passion for detective novels. And one day, the fish was patrolling his part of the river when he made an interesting discovery. Just underneath the bridge, beside a rock in the riverbed, he found a credit card. Now, in this day of contactless payments, the fish could have gone on a spending spree. There were lots of new detective novels the fish wanted to buy. It would have been easy to do so. No one would ever catch him. Fish had never been caught. But this fish was an honest fish. He decided that he would make it his mission to return the credit card to its rightful owner. Fish put his knowledge of detective work to good use. It took him 3 days to track down the owner of the credit card. Can't quite see that bit because he managed to track down the owner who lived at the top of a skyscraper in the city. Fish had a plan. With the credit card in mouth, he swam up and around the city pipes. Eventually, he reached the top of the skyscraper and surfaced in this credit card owner's toilet. And what incredible timing. At that exact moment, the credit card owner was just about to sit down to have a poo. What a fright he got when he saw the fish pop up. But what a pleasant surprise to be reunited with his missing credit card. Thank you, fish. If only there were more honest fish like you in the world. The world would be a better place. How can I ever thank you? Well, said the fish, I would appreciate it if you could wait a few minutes before doing that poo. And if you would be good enough to flush the toilet, we'll call it evens. So the credit card owner pulled the plug or flushed the toilet, and fish was flushed all the way back, down the tower, through the city pipes, and back home to his river. Fish had his dinner, read a couple of chapters of his latest detective novel, and went to sleep. Now, that is a much stronger story after we worked on these basic principles than the stories that came from our members before. It is fun, isn't it? There is nothing just happens for the sake of it happening. Everything happens for a reason. Even the skyscraper, there was relevancy there for the pipes going up, So, and we took and it came off the back of some of these principles that came out of the lesson plan for story dice. So that's it, really. That's everything I have to share with you today. My goodness me, look at that time. We finished 1 minute before the hour. So I'd like to say thank you so much to those of you who have, just before you go, and I always forget to ask this, I always mean to ask this halfway through, could you do me a big favor and like this video and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already done this. And if you enjoyed this session and you copy the URL, you can now just share the recording in any of your Facebook groups or LinkedIn or whatever. And I'd be so grateful if you could do this. I do work very hard on these LessonStream lives. And so it'd mean a lot to me if you could share them. So just copy and paste that URL into any of your communities or share them with other teachers. And automatically the recording will appear as if by magic. All right. Thanks so much to all of you who've turned up to this, and I'll see you at the next LessonStream Live. Thanks so much, Simon, and thanks so much, everybody. Bye-bye now. Bye.